Wrong carriage. A story in one part. The rain started the way bad decisions always do, quietly, and then all at once. Eleanor Voss stood on platform 2 of Harrowdene station with one trunk, one hat that was losing the argument with the wind, and exactly 7 shillings to her name. She had counted them that morning, then counted them again on the coach to the station, then once more in her coat pocket, because a woman in her position, third daughter of a family that owed money to everyone from their solicitor to their bootmaker, needed to know exactly what she had at all times. 7 shillings. She could work with 7 shillings. What she could not work with was rain coming in sideways at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a platform full of strangers in dark coats who all looked the same from a distance, and a letter from her cousin Dorothy that had said, and she had the letter, she had it right here, she could show you the exact wording. Her cousin Dorothy's hired carriage would be waiting. Dark lacquered sides, 2 grays, would be impossible to miss. Eleanor looked at the row of carriages at the end of the platform. Dark lacquered sides, 2 grays, at least 3 of them. She pulled the letter out again. The ink had run a little at the edges from the damp. She squinted at it in the gray afternoon light and thought, not for the first time, that her cousin Dorothy had the handwriting of someone who had learned it from a doctor, which was to say, it was technically a language, but only just. The letters leaned in different directions with the confidence of people who had no idea they were lost. The word carriage had a capital C that might have been a G. The phrase impossible to miss was, given everything, a little funny in hindsight. She thought about asking someone on the platform. She looked at the people around her. A woman in a red coat who was managing 3 children and a dog simultaneously, and was clearly managing all 4 of them less well than she would have liked. A man in a black coat reading a paper with deep suspicion. 2 porters moving luggage with the focused energy of people who had somewhere else to be. She decided none of them looked like someone who would know the difference between one set of dark lacquered sides and another. She picked the middle carriage. This was, in retrospect, the only mistake she made. Every single thing that happened after it was the fault of the rain, the letter, the ink, and one bad decision in a life that had already collected a fair number of them. She did not look at the crest on the door. Later, she would think about this. She would think about it quite a lot, actually, in the weeks that followed, while lying in the dark with her eyes open at 2 in the morning, in a way that had become something of a habit since her father's health had gone and the bills had come. She would think, if she had simply looked at the crest on the door, none of it would have happened. She would have seen a crest that was not her cousin Dorothy's household mark. She would have apologized to a footman. She would have gone to the correct carriage, arrived at Dorothy's house by 8, eaten a late supper, and gone to sleep in the spare room that Dorothy had been carefully airing for a week. She would have been fine, but the crest was covered in mud. Not a little mud, generous mud, rain thoroughgoing mud, the kind that filled every carved line and turned the whole thing into a flat brown oval that could have been anything. A family crest, an old scar on the wood, a very dedicated pigeon that had made some choices. Eleanor had stared at it for perhaps 3 seconds and decided it was not her problem to interpret and got in. And the door was open. And a footman was holding an umbrella over it, with the expression of a man who had been doing this for a while and intended to keep doing it, and had no particular opinions about who stepped under the umbrella, so long as someone did. And Eleanor Voss was wet and cold, and carrying 7 shillings, and she stepped up and sat down. The door closed. She exhaled. Let the warmth of the carriage, real warmth, not the grudging warmth of a coal fire in a house that couldn't afford coal but got some anyway, but the warmth of a heated brick placed under the seat by someone who had thought of it in advance, work its way through the damp wool of her coat. She settled her trunk. She adjusted her hat, which had given up being a hat with a shape and was now more of a hat with intentions. She pulled off her gloves and pressed her fingers together to encourage the feeling back into them. She thought about Dorothy's house, and a hot supper, and the spare room, and the general promise of things being, for a while, slightly less difficult. Then she looked up. There was a man across from her. She had not registered a man. She registered him now. He was, the word her mind reached for was architectural, not because he was particularly large, though he was, because he had the quality of something load-bearing, something that had been built, not grown. He sat the way towers sit, perfectly still, with no apparent interest in whether anything else was moving around them. His coat was the dark gray of a decision already made. His hands were folded in his lap with the ease of someone who had made peace with having hands. He had the kind of stillness that you only see in men who have either found very deep peace or who are holding something extremely tightly beneath the surface, and Eleanor had enough experience with both kinds to know they looked identical from the outside. He was looking at her. Not the way men usually looked at women in carriages, the quick flick down, the reassessment, the polite performance of not staring. He was simply looking at her, with an expression that had not moved and showed no signs of moving, like a man who had all the time in the world and had decided to spend a portion of it on her face. Eleanor said, with great confidence and very little air in her lungs, "I believe I'm in the wrong carriage." He said nothing. She said, "This is a carriage." He looked at her. "Not my carriage," she clarified. "I mean, clearly it is a carriage. I can see that. I'm sitting in it. What I mean is that I believe it is not the carriage I intended to sit in." He said, "No." One word, just the one, delivered with the precise minimal energy of a man who had decided, at some point in his life, that economy of speech was either a virtue or a weapon, and had never found reason to revisit the decision. Eleanor looked at the door. The carriage was moving. She knew who he was. Not immediately. Immediately she knew he was someone. The coat alone told her that. The cut of it, the way the fabric moved, the buttons that were not decorative and were also not cheap, the way the footman had held the umbrella at that exact angle, not servile but precise, the angle of a man who had learned the job from someone who took the job seriously. The interior of the carriage itself, deep cushioned, clean, with the quiet quality of something maintained rather than restored. Small things that added up to a category before they added up to a name. Then she placed him. She placed him the way you place a face from a portrait you have seen in someone else's house, that flicker of recognition that arrives a beat before the name, so you stand there with your mouth open while your brain finishes the sentence. Caspian Aldrich, Duke of Harrowdene, who had inherited the title at 23 and the debts at 24, and had spent the following decade doing something to both that nobody in polite society quite understood, but everyone in polite society respected, in the tightly held, slightly afraid way that people respect things they do not fully understand. He was not talked about warmly at dinner parties. He was talked about accurately, which was a different kind of respect and considerably rarer. He had a reputation for being exceptionally difficult to deceive, which meant that people who needed to deceive someone went somewhere else, and people who could not afford to be deceived came to him, and by this arrangement he had built something out of an inheritance that had arrived in pieces. Eleanor said, "I'll scream." He looked at her. She said, "I'm being entirely serious." He said, "I know." Then he looked out the window. That was the moment. Right there. That was the moment Eleanor Voss understood that she was not going to scream, and that he had known she wasn't going to scream before she had known it, and that this should have made her angry. It did make her angry, but somewhere underneath the anger was something she didn't have a word for yet, which was the feeling of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to look closely. She straightened her gloves instead, which she had already taken off, so she put them back on, then straightened them, then took them off again, and held them in her lap like they were an object that required guarding. She looked at the window. The platform was long gone. The outskirts of Harrowdene were going past in the rain, the backs of houses, wet gardens, the particular grey of November in the north of England that was not melancholy exactly, but was definitely not cheering anyone up. A row of rooftops, a dog in a doorway, watching the rain, with the practical acceptance of a creature that had concluded opinions about the weather were not useful. Then fields. The rain hit the carriage windows. The horses moved. Outside, Harrowdene station fell away behind them, and Dorothy's carriage sat in the rain at the other end of the platform, waiting for someone who was not coming. He offered her terms at the first village. Not terms exactly. He didn't negotiate. What he did was look at her and say, with the same spare precision he applied to everything, "There is a coaching inn at Kettleford, 12 miles. I can arrange alternate transport there." Eleanor said, "That's very considerate." He said, "It's practical." She looked at the window. The rain was now doing that thing where it wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite hail, but was some determined third thing that fell sideways and found gaps in collars and cuffs that you'd have sworn weren't there. The fields they were passing had a waterlogged look about them, the look of land that had given up on the idea of not being wet and was simply water now, wearing a thin disguise of grass. A crow sat on a gatepost with the expression of a creature that had made its peace with all of this very early on in life and found a certain grim satisfaction in having been right. She said, "I'll manage until Kettleford." He said, "You always do, Miss Voss." She went very still, the kind of still that isn't calm, the kind that is the body buying time while the mind catches up. She said, "You know my name." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. He knew her name. He had known it since she sat down. He had watched her try to become furniture, watched her look at the door, look at the window, arrange and rearrange her gloves, calculate the situation with those sharp dark eyes, and he had said nothing and known her name the entire time. She thought about what this meant. She thought about it for a long moment, while the rain came down and the carriage moved and the crow on the gatepost got smaller and then disappeared entirely. She said, "That was unkind of you, not to say something immediately." He said, "Yes, and yet you didn't." A pause, the longest she'd heard from him yet, which was still not very long. "No," he said, "I didn't." Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the window. His profile, from this angle, was the kind of profile that painters chose for coins, all clean lines, and that particular jaw that said nothing and somehow said everything about the kind of man he was, the kind who had been told he was right about things for so long that he had stopped checking, or the kind who had been wrong about enough things that he'd gotten quiet about all of it. She wasn't sure which. She was already trying to figure it out, which was its own kind of problem, because Eleanor Voss had enough problems and did not need to be adding new ones, shaped like the interior lives of difficult men in expensive carriages. She said, "Why did you let me sit here?" He turned his head, looked at her. She said, "You could have said, immediately, when I sat down. You could have said I was in the wrong carriage and I would have gotten out and found the right one, and this would all be very simple." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes. And?" "It was raining." She looked at him. He said, "You were wet, and the carriage was warm, and you were going to figure it out eventually anyway. And in the meantime?" He turned back to the window. Somewhere in what might have been the architecture of his profile, there was something that might have been the very beginning of an expression. She couldn't have said what kind. It was gone too quickly. He said, "In the meantime, you were here." Eleanor held on to that for a moment, and then decided, wisely, not to examine it too closely. Not yet. She was cold, and she was wet, and she was in a carriage going in the wrong direction, and she had 7 shillings, and she could manage all of that. She could absolutely manage all of that. What she could not do, not right now, was examine what it meant that a man who said 7 words an hour had used 3 of them to explain that her presence was a fact he had noticed and had not chosen to interrupt. She looked out the window instead. The crow was long gone. They talked. Not warmly, at first. Not with the bright social performance Eleanor had been doing since she was 16, the one she kept ready like a party dress she didn't particularly want to wear, but kept pressed and available. The light laugh, the clever but not threatening observation, the graceful pivot away from anything that might make a man feel challenged, the interested questions asked in exactly the tone that said interested, but not excessively so. She had worn that dress so long she had stopped noticing it. It had become a second skin. It left no room for anything heavier. He didn't give her space to put it on. His questions were strange, not in their content, nothing inappropriate, nothing that crossed any line of propriety. Strange in their shape. He asked about her cousin Dorothy not as small talk but as a genuine inquiry, and then listened to the answer with an attention that was slightly unnerving, like a man doing calculations in his head while you spoke and arriving at conclusions you hadn't offered. He asked how long she had known her cousin. He asked what Dorothy's household was like, the size of it, the general arrangements, whether she had family nearby. He asked how Eleanor and Dorothy had spent their time growing up together, and when Eleanor said they had spent summers in the same county and written letters regularly since they were girls, he nodded in the way of a man filing information away carefully. He asked, and this was where Eleanor's performance dress simply slid off her shoulders entirely, and she had nothing underneath it she was prepared to show anyone, whether she was going to stay. She said, "For a visit." He said, "That's not what I asked." Eleanor looked at him. He said, "Are you going to stay?" She said, without quite meaning to, "I don't know where else to go." It came out smaller than she intended. 4 words with the bones of something much larger rattling inside them. The debts, the house that was already half sold at the edges, her father who slept most of the day now and smiled when she came in like a man happy to see her and unable to remember quite why. The doctor's visits that were becoming less about treatment and more about what they carefully called managing expectations, which Eleanor had found was the phrase grown men used when they meant that there was nothing more to be done, but that they couldn't quite bring themselves to say it outright. The 3 younger cousins who looked to Eleanor because she was the one who had always seemed to know what came next, and Eleanor smiling and saying it would all come right, because someone had to say it. She had not said any of this out loud to anyone. She had said she was visiting Dorothy. She said it to everyone who asked. She said it in the mirror some mornings to practice the tone so it came out the right weight, not too light, not too heavy, just the right amount of fine. She said 4 words in a carriage to a man she didn't know, and the bones fell right out of them. He didn't say anything. She would realize later that this was the particular thing about him, the quality that made him dangerous, without his being large or loud or imposing in any way that she could have identified and defended against. He made silence into a container, a place where things could sit and breathe without being immediately managed or redirected or given a bright coat of paint. Eleanor had spent the last 3 years managing things. Every feeling that arrived got folded and arranged and organized into something small enough to carry without it showing. His silence made her put it down. Not dramatically, not with tears, which she would have been genuinely horrified by. She just stopped carrying it for a moment, breathed, looked out the window at the gray November countryside running past, brown hedgerows, damp fields, a sky the color of good intentions going slightly wrong, and said nothing more. He said nothing more. They were quiet together for almost 20 minutes, which was the longest Eleanor had gone without managing anything in about 2 years. Outside the window, November kept being November, which it was very good at. It began with the drainage. He had said something, a brief observation about the fields they were passing, something about the ditches being poorly maintained, the kind of comment that could have been small talk if he were the kind of man who made small talk, which he clearly was not, so it was simply an actual observation about an actual field. Eleanor would have let it slide past in any normal conversation. What did she know about drainage ditches? As it turned out, quite a lot. Her father had been a careful man, before. He had walked his tenant land every spring without fail. He had taken Eleanor with him from the time she was 8, not because it was conventional to take your daughters on estate inspections. It was not, and he knew it was not, and he had decided not to care, but because he had 3 daughters and no sons, and he was the kind of man who decided, quietly and without announcement, to play the hand he had been dealt with as much grace as the hand allowed. He had shown her how to read the slope of a field, how to tell good drainage from bad by looking at the grasses, how to look at a ditch in February and know what March would bring. She had stood in fields in Wellington boots at the age of 9, and listened to farmers explain why their lower field flooded every year. And her father had listened, and she had listened beside him, and this was the education she had got. She said, "The drainage is only part of it. If you look at the slope of that field, the one to the north there, the whole east side is running wrong. The water doesn't have anywhere to go except into the lower field, which means the lower field floods every March, which means whoever farms it loses a month of growing season minimum. Sometimes more, if March runs wet." A pause. She became aware, approximately 1 second too late, that she had just said quite a lot of words, very quickly and with some confidence, to a duke about drainage. She started to say something diplomatic. He said, "You're right." She stopped. He was still looking at the field, which had by now moved mostly past them. He said, "The whole valley here has the same problem. I've had 3 surveyors out since I inherited Harrowdene. None of them said what you just said in 40 seconds. Eleanor said, perhaps they didn't want to tell you it would require significant regrading. He said, it would. It would also cost quite a lot. I know. But your tenants are losing a month of growing season, which means they're losing a portion of what they can earn, which means the rents are harder on them than they look on paper when you read them." He looked at her, not with the expression of a man being challenged, with the expression of a man who found the challenge genuinely interesting, which was worse, because she hadn't prepared for interesting, she had prepared for dismissal, which she could have handled easily, or polite argument, which she was very good at. Interesting left her with nothing to push against, no resistance to brace herself on, just his attention, which was the same quality as his silence, a container that things kept filling up. He said, "Yes, and that's a problem that costs them, not you. Yes, and you've known about it." "I've known," he said, carefully, "that there was a problem. I didn't know the shape of it." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable and then looked back at where the field had been. Another field was running past, equally damp, equally not technically her business. She said, more quietly, "I walked the tenants' fields every spring, with my father, when he could still walk them." She said it the way she always said things about her father now, in that careful, not quite past tense, that wasn't past tense because he was still alive, still in the house, still smiling when she came in. It was just that the man who had walked the fields, the one who had shown her how to read the slope of the land, and had listened to the farmers, and had taken her with him because he had decided, quietly, that she was worth teaching, that man she was beginning to understand, she had already lost. The grief of it had no grammar yet. She was still looking for the words for what you lost before the person was gone. He said nothing. She was genuinely grateful. At some point in the 4th hour, the carriage window blew open. Not dramatically. The latch was old, and the rain had been working at it for the better part of 2 hours, and eventually the rain won, as it generally does when it has sufficient patience and the other side is old iron hardware. The window banged. Cold air came in. Eleanor flinched. He moved across the carriage, quickly, for a man who generally seemed to move through the world like someone with all the time in the world, and caught the window and pulled it shut. He was leaning across her to reach the latch, one hand braced on the wall above her shoulder, his coat very close, his whole solid presence briefly and entirely in her space. His sleeve grazed her wrist. That was all. Wool against skin. Less than a second. She did not move. She noticed, very clearly, that she did not move, that she could have pulled her arm back, shifted in the seat, created the inch of distance that every convention of propriety would have suggested. She noticed herself not doing it, the way you notice yourself standing at the edge of something high and not stepping back, standing there with a full, clear view of the drop, and your feet making no decision to move. He secured the latch. He returned to his seat. He did not mention it. Of course he didn't. He mentioned almost nothing. He had the discipline of a man who had learned, at some cost, to leave things alone, to let things sit where they landed. But he had noticed. She knew he had noticed because of the quality of the silence afterward. Not uncomfortable, not loaded with the weight of something being very carefully not said, just the silence of something having been registered and then held, quietly, between them, like a small thing passed hand to hand with no need to name it or decide what it was. Eleanor looked at her wrist. She was still not wearing her gloves. She had taken them off again at some point in the past 2 hours without noticing. They were sitting in her lap. She had been holding them, and then at some point she had simply put them down. She left them there. The carriage moved through the darkening afternoon, and the rain came down, and both of them said nothing, and it was the most comfortable silence Eleanor could remember in a very long time. The coaching inn at Kettleford was called the Anchor, and smelled of coal smoke and beef and lamp oil and the particular honest exhaustion of a place that had been working since before either of them were born. The sign above the door showed an anchor that might once have been painted blue and was now more of a general weathered intention in the direction of blue. It had the look of a building that had never tried to be more than what it was and had consequently become exactly what it was, which is the best thing a building can be. The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door. The rain had slowed to the kind of fine, persistent drizzle that isn't really rain anymore but is rain's stubborn opinion about the matter. Eleanor stepped down onto the cobbles. The Duke stepped down behind her. His man, there was a man, a secretary or steward, quiet and capable-looking, who had apparently been riding with the driver this entire time and whose existence Eleanor had not suspected until now, appeared and received a series of low instructions she didn't hear. Then he went inside the Anchor with the purposeful movement of someone who had been given a task and intended to complete it correctly. She stood on the step with the drizzle coming down and thought, right then, alternate transport, Cousin Dorothy, back on track, all of this is fine. 7 shillings, Dorothy's address, the spare room, the right words. Fine. She said, I should thank you for the warmth and the conversation and she gestured, generally, at the carriage and the 6 hours and all of it, for not making things more complicated than they needed to be. He was watching her. She said, I'll be perfectly fine from here. He said, yes. A pause that was longer than his pauses usually were. He said, but you won't go. Eleanor blinked. She said, I beg your pardon? He said it again, not louder, not differently, the same words, at the same measured volume, with the same complete absence of drama, as though he were simply stating something he had already established as a fact and was now gently informing her of. You won't go. She said, that is the most presumptuous. He stepped back to the carriage. He reached up and took the door handle in one hand, slowly, not fast, not dramatic, not theatrical in any way she could have pointed at and objected to on the grounds of theater. Just deliberate, the way he did everything, like a man who had decided what he was going to do several minutes before he did it, and was simply arriving at the execution of it now, without hurry, without performance. He looked at her. He locked the door. She stared at him. He said, no, you're exactly where you belong. She should have said something. She had quite a lot of things she could have said. Sharp things, accurate things. Things that would have made a very satisfying point about propriety, and about the fundamental problem of a man who locked carriage doors at coaching inns and told women they were exactly where they belonged, as though that were a reasonable thing to say out loud. What she did instead was stand there on the cobbles of Kettleford with the fine drizzle coming down and look at him. He was looking at her. She thought about belong. He had not said welcome. He had not said wanted or invited or hoped. Belong. The way a key belongs in a lock. The way a particular bird belongs to a particular hedgerow, not by choice or invitation, but by the simple fact of it being true. A fact about the world that she simply had not been told yet. She thought about 7 shillings, about Dorothy's house and all the right words, about going back and being fine, and managing everything and getting on with it. She thought about the loose button on his left cuff. She had noticed it in the 3rd hour, the second button from the wrist, the thread starting to go, the kind of small maintenance failure that accumulates when a person is busy with larger things. It was the only thing about him that wasn't perfectly managed. It sat on his sleeve like a small flag planted by some earlier version of him, the one that had existed before whatever had happened to make him this still, this careful, this precise about everything except one button on one cuff. She stepped up into the carriage. She sat down. She did not look at him. She said, to the middle distance directly in front of her nose, "If you say anything that resembles 'I told you so,' I will get out at the very next village. I mean it absolutely." She heard him step up. The door closed. The carriage shifted slightly with his weight settling. He said nothing. The carriage moved. Behind them, through the window, the alternate transport that his man had arranged sat in the courtyard of the Anchor, patient and empty, the horses indifferent, rain falling on the roof over no one inside. She arrived at Harrowdene Hall at 8:20 in the evening. The house was, she had expected something imposing, because he was imposing and people generally built or kept houses that reflected who they were. What she found was large and old and complicated in a way that imposing didn't quite cover. Harrowdene had the look of a building that had been through several things and had formed opinions about all of them. The stone was dark with rain. The east wing was lit. The west wing was not, which gave the whole facade the feeling of a face seen in partial shadow. Ivy was doing what Ivy always does, attempting a slow, patient, decades-long takeover of everything, starting with the corners and working methodically inward. There were dogs somewhere she could hear, not barking, just present in the way that well-kept dogs are present, aware and commenting on nothing. The entrance hall was warm, not expensively warm, not the warmth of a house that was trying to make a point about its warmth, just warm, in the way of a house where someone had thought about warmth as something people needed and had arranged accordingly. The housekeeper was named Mrs. Tanner. Mrs. Tanner was a woman of late middle age who had the look of someone who had been organizing large things for a long time and was no longer surprised by any particular arrangement of events. She had steady eyes and good posture and the kind of warmth that was practical rather than sentimental, which Eleanor found immediately and completely trustworthy. Sentimental warmth required a performance from the person receiving it. Practical warmth just was. She received Eleanor without a flicker of visible surprise. Not because she wasn't surprised. Eleanor would discover later, from a kitchen conversation she was not meant to hear, that Mrs. Tanner had been extremely surprised. But she had made a professional decision some decades ago that visible surprise served no one, and she had kept to this through what she once referred to, very briefly, as considerable testing. She showed Eleanor to a room on the second floor, east wing. Fire in the grate, already going. A bed with more pillows than Eleanor had used in aggregate over the past 3 years. A window looking out on black wet gardens where shapes that were probably box hedges made geometric suggestions against the dark. Mrs. Tanner brought tea without being asked. Then a tray with cold roast chicken and bread and butter and a small jar of something dark red and preserved that turned out to be plum. She said, "If there's anything you need, miss, just ring." Eleanor looked around the room, at the fire, at the bed, at the jar of plum preserve sitting on the tray in the lamplight. She said, "Thank you. This is—" She stopped. The words that would complete that sentence were all too large and too true for this particular moment, and she had spent 3 years not saying large true things out loud, so nothing came. She tried a different sentence. "Thank you." Mrs. Tanner, who had survived 2 wars and 4 dukes and a chimney fire that had taken the entire north kitchen and 1 very bad winter she never discussed in specific terms, looked at Eleanor with those steady, practical eyes and said, "Of course, miss," and left and closed the door with the quiet precision of someone who understood that some moments needed to be left alone with themselves. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed. She ate the plum preserve straight from the jar with a spoon, which was entirely the wrong way to eat plum preserve, and she did not care at all. This was the first entirely selfish thing she had done in 3 years. It tasted aggressively, unreservedly good. On the evening of the second day, something shifted. Not in any dramatic way. Not with the announcement of itself that moments in stories are supposed to make. The clear signal that says, here, this is the thing. Remember this. It happened quietly, in the way that most real things happen, sideways, while she was looking at something else. She had come down to dinner a little late, because she had been annotating one more section of the survey maps, and had lost track of the time, which was something she did now apparently, lost track of time, which was new. Before Harrowdene, she had been very aware of time at all moments. Time was what you managed when you had too many things in it and not enough of yourself to go around. But the library had eaten an hour without her noticing, and she had arrived to dinner slightly breathless and with pencil marks on her right hand. He was already there, reading something, which was where he always was, and he looked up when she came in. She said, "I'm sorry, I lost track." He said, "Don't apologize." She sat down. Mrs. Tanner brought the soup, which was the kind of soup that someone had been thinking about for a while. Not just the idea of soup, but the actual soup, the specific vegetables and the stock, and the timing of it. They ate for a while in the quiet that had stopped being awkward sometime in the first day and become something else. The silence of two people who had found, without particularly intending to, that being in the same room together was a thing that did not require maintenance. Then he said, "Tell me about the house." She looked up. He said, "Yours. Your father's house." She put her spoon down. She thought about the house, the east wing shut up for winter, the garden that her mother had planted 30 years ago, and that Eleanor still kept going with the help of one very committed gardener, who had refused 3 times to accept that the family could no longer properly afford him, and kept coming anyway. The kitchen with its cracked tile on the floor by the range that her father had always meant to fix. The room at the back that caught the morning light, and where she had read every book she had read in the past 10 years, and sat with her father in the afternoons when he was well enough to sit, and where she had cried exactly twice in 3 years because she had not wanted to do it where anyone could hear. She said, "It's a good house." He waited. She said, "It needs work. It has always needed work. My father, before, he was going to see to the roof on the west side. There's a section that will be a problem by next autumn if it isn't addressed." He said, "Is there anyone managing it?" "Our solicitor, and my cousin Henry, when he can. But Henry is in Chester and has his own." She stopped. "Henry has his own things." He said, "And the staff." "We kept 3. Mrs. Owen, and Price the gardener, and William, who does most things." She looked at the soup. They've all stayed," he said carefully, "because they want to, because my father was a good employer for 30 years, and because they are good people," she said. "Not because of any particular material incentive I have been able to offer them recently." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What does the roof need?" She looked at him. He said, "The west roof section. What does it need, specifically?" She told him. She had in fact looked at it very carefully in September, and knew exactly what it needed, because she had learned from her father that the difference between knowing what something needed and not knowing was the difference between being able to plan for it and simply being overtaken by it when it came. He listened, asked 2 questions, both specific, both the questions of a man who understood how buildings worked. She answered them. They finished the soup. Mrs. Tanner brought the next course. Outside the dining room windows, the November dark was absolute, and the wind was doing something complicated with the trees. And inside it was warm and quiet, and Eleanor was talking about a roof in a way that she had not been able to talk about anything for 3 years, which was to say, plainly, without managing the tone, without calculating what it was safe to let show. He said, at one point, "I know a roofer in Kendal who does good work." She said, "I can't afford." He said, "I'll write to him." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "That's not—" She searched for the right word. "That's not necessary. I'm managing." He said, "I know you are." A pause. He said, "You can manage something and also let someone help with it. Those are not exclusive." Eleanor held this for a moment. It was a simple thing to say. She had known it, technically, as information about how the world was supposed to work, the way you know things you have never actually practiced. She had not practiced it. She said, "I'll think about it." He said, "All right." And that was all. He did not press. He did not make her feel the weight of what she had said. He simply accepted what she'd offered, which was not an agreement, just an openness, and moved on, and she sat across from him in the warm dining room and thought about her father's house, and the west roof, and the cracked kitchen tile, and Price the gardener, who kept coming even when she had told him not to, and she felt something that she could not quite name, which was what it felt like when you had been carrying something so long that putting it down didn't feel like relief yet. It felt like your arms not knowing what to do. She picked up her fork. She ate the rest of the meal. At the end of the evening, when she said goodnight, he said, "The roofer's name is Holt. He's reliable." She said, "I'll remember that." She went upstairs. She lay in the dark. She thought about 7 shillings and a roof, and a man who had, without any discussion, decided to know the name of a reliable roofer on her behalf. She fell asleep faster than she had in a very long time. She stayed 3 days. The excuse was weather, because the weather on the second morning was genuinely bad, not dangerous, not dramatic, but the kind of November persistence that a reasonable person could look at through a window and decide warranted another day's consideration before going out in it. She told herself this. It was true, as far as it went. The third day the weather was perfectly fine, cold and clear and honest about it. She stayed anyway. By the third day she had stopped needing an excuse, because she had stopped looking for one, which was its own kind of information about something, though she was not yet ready to look at it directly. The house opened up around her, the way large houses do when you stop moving through them like a visitor, and start existing in them instead. The library was ground floor, east wing, a serious room, tall shelves, good chairs, a working desk covered in real papers with actual marks on them. The kitchen garden she walked through on the second afternoon and stood in for a long time watching 2 cats coordinate around a mouse problem with the focused professional energy of creatures who had identified their purpose early and committed to it. The walled garden was brown and dormant for winter, but the bones of it were entirely clear, and Eleanor stood in the cold air and saw what it would be in April and thought that whoever had designed it had understood exactly what they were doing. She saw him at meals, which were quiet and not uncomfortable. She saw him in the library. On the second morning, she went to the library thinking she would be alone. He was there. She said she would go. He said don't. She stayed and took a book from the shelf nearest to her, a natural history of the British Isles that turned out to contain significantly more information about beetles than she had anticipated, and sat at the far end of the room and read about beetles. He read whatever he was reading. The fire went. The clock on the mantel moved through 2 hours. Neither of them said anything. It was the most comfortable Eleanor had been since before the debts. That was the thing that unsettled her, thinking about it afterward. Not him specifically. Not the house. The comfort itself. The feeling of being in a room and not performing anything. Not bracing for what came next. Not managing anything. She had been 3 steps ahead of every feeling for 3 years, staying ahead of things so they couldn't catch her from behind. In this library, with this fire, with this man who read across the room and made silence into somewhere you could breathe, she kept forgetting to stay ahead. She let herself forget. They argued on the second afternoon. About the tenants. Not angrily, she would not have called herself an angry person, but with the sharpness of 2 people who both had strong views about something that mattered, and neither of whom was going to be polite about it at the cost of being right. He had been explaining something to his steward in the corridor outside the library. The door was open. She was not eavesdropping. The house simply had generous acoustics, and she happened to be at the right end of the room. She heard him describe a plan for the east field drainage that was technically correct in every individual component and missed the actual problem in the way that you miss something when you have read about it very carefully and never stood in the relevant field at the end of February. She appeared in the doorway. His steward, whose name was Mr. Beckwith, looked at her with the measured expression of a professional who had learned to take unexpected variables in stride. She said, "The regrading won't fix the east field if you don't address the ditch system to the west of it first. The problem isn't the slope. The slope is a symptom. You'll spend a significant amount of money regrading it, and in 5 years the water will have found the same path again, because the underlying cause is still there." Silence. The Duke looked at her. Mr. Beckwith looked at the Duke. Eleanor became aware, a beat too late, that she had walked into a working conversation between a duke and his estate steward and told them both they were wrong. She said, "I apologize. I shouldn't have." The Duke said, "You're right." She stopped. He said it again. "You're right." Then to Mr. Beckwith, "Bring the survey maps to the library this afternoon. Miss Voss will look at them." Mr. Beckwith said, "Yes, Your Grace," and left with the air of a man who would process this instruction privately at a later time. Eleanor stood in the doorway and said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "No. It will seem strange. My being consulted on estate matters. People will ask questions about why I'm here." He looked at her with that look, the quiet, direct one she had spent 2 days developing a complicated relationship with, and said, "Let them." 2 words. She stood in the doorway for another moment, and then walked into the library and sat at the desk. And when Mr. Beckwith arrived an hour later with the survey maps, she spent 2 hours with a pencil annotating every place the surveys were wrong, which was more places than she had expected, and he sat across from her and asked questions, some of which were about drainage, and some of which, she noted, were not about drainage at all. She came downstairs on the morning of the 4th day, and the carriage was ready. She stood in the entrance hall and looked at it through the tall front window. Clear morning, cold. The kind of honest November day that has no excuses to offer and makes none. The horses were ready. Her trunk was being loaded. On the hall table, Dorothy's address in Mrs. Tanner's careful handwriting on a card. He had arranged everything. She stood there in her coat and the hat that had mostly recovered from the Harrowdene rain and looked at the card and the carriage and thought about getting in. She thought about 7 shillings. Still in her pocket. She had spent nothing here. Eaten, slept, read, annotated maps, drank coffee on 3 mornings in a room with a fire, and spent nothing because nothing had been required of her. She thought about Dorothy's house and the spare room and all the right words. She thought about the loose button on his left cuff and the fact that she had thought about it at 2 in the morning on both nights she had been here, which was either very silly or very truthful about something. She reached up and took off her gloves. She set them on the side table next to Dorothy's card. She walked away from the front door, through the hall, down the corridor, to the library. He was there. Of course he was. Earlier than anyone, with coffee and papers, with that still, useful quality of a man who had found early mornings good for the kind of thinking that the rest of the day's noise made harder. He looked up. She stood in the doorway. No gloves. The carriage was ready. The address was on the card. She said, "The ditch system on the south boundary. I was thinking about it last night. There is a simpler solution than what we looked at yesterday, but it requires cooperation from whoever owns the land to your south. Do you have a reasonable relationship with them?" He looked at her. That look, the one that wasn't quite expressionless, the one that had something in it she had never quite been able to name, something in the direction of a man carefully keeping the corner of his mouth where it was, because he had something he could say and was choosing not to say it yet. He said, "Sit down, Miss Voss." She sat down. He poured her a cup of coffee. She took it. It was the exact temperature she would have asked for. He said, "The neighbor to the south is a man named Whitmore. Reasonable when his own interests are made sufficiently clear. So if we frame the ditch proposal in terms of what it does for his lower field, He'd listen. Would he agree? Not immediately, but with the right argument. Yes, he said, with the right argument. Eleanor held the coffee cup in both hands and thought about the ditch system and about making arguments to difficult men and about being in this room in the early morning with the fire going and nothing required of her at all. She said, "I can write the proposal if that would be useful." He said, "It would." Neither of them said anything about the carriage. Neither of them said anything about the card on the hall table, or the gloves sitting beside it, or the fact that Eleanor had put down everything she had been carrying for 3 years and walked back into the library as though the decision had already been made somewhere below language. The coffee was very good. She thought about mentioning that. Then she just drank it. Later, weeks later, after things had become what they became, after the conversations that began as conversations about survey maps became something else entirely, after a particular evening by the fire when he had said something quiet and she had said something back, and neither of them had pretended the moment was anything other than what it was. Later, Eleanor tried to explain it to Dorothy. Dorothy, who was kind and who had been waiting with the spare room and the right words for a long time, listened with the expression of a woman following a story that kept turning in directions she hadn't predicted. She said, "But you were in the wrong carriage." Eleanor said, "Yes. You just stayed. I got back in, actually. I got out first, at the Kettleford Inn, and then I got back in." Dorothy thought about this with full attention. She said, "Why?" Eleanor thought about 6 hours in a carriage in the rain, about the warm brick at her feet, and the cold window, and his silence that was a container, about 4 words that had come out of her with 3 years of bones rattling inside them, and the way he had let the silence after them be long enough for her to breathe, about the beetles and the survey maps and the coffee, about the loose button and the way he had said she was exactly where she belonged, as though it were a fact about geography she simply hadn't been given the information for yet. She said, "He told me I was exactly where I belonged." Dorothy said, very reasonably, "That's enormously presumptuous." Eleanor said, "Yes." A pause. He was right, though. Dorothy held all of her feelings about this with dignity for a long moment. Then she sipped her tea. She looked at Eleanor, sitting across from her the way Eleanor sat now, differently than before, with less of the careful bracing, less of the constant readiness. Dorothy said, "Are you happy?" Eleanor thought about it properly. Not the quick yes. Not the managed yes she had kept ready for years. The actual answer. The one that lived in the part of her she had stopped locking up sometime in November, in a carriage with rain on the windows and a man who made silence somewhere you could put things down. She said, "I think I'm getting there." Dorothy, who had known Eleanor for her entire life and understood exactly how much that meant, from a woman who had spent 3 years saying everything was fine, nodded once. She poured more tea. She asked if Eleanor wanted a biscuit. She did. Back at Harrowdene Hall, in the entrance hall, on the side table beside a card with a cousin's address in careful handwriting, 2 gloves sat in the thin November light that came through the east window every morning at exactly this hour. Nobody moved them. Days went past. The light moved across them, and then moved away. Mrs. Tanner, who understood things without being told them, dusted carefully around them every morning with the attention of a woman who had learned over a long career to tell the difference between the things that were waiting to be put away and the things that had found where they belonged and had decided to stay. The gloves stayed. For quite a long while, nobody moved them at all.